Welcome to Veritate with your host, Johnny Mack, a podcast that will dive deep into the pursuit of truth in a world filled with noise, confusion, and fleeting opinions. We will seek to uncover the eternal, unshakable truths that shape our lives and our beliefs, from faith and philosophy to history and culture. We'll explore the questions that matter, challenge the answers we've been given, and seek the wisdom that has stood the test of time. So join Johnny Mack in this journey to discover what's real, what's right, and what's true.
Thank you for listening once again to Veritate, and I'm your host, Johnny Mack. I'm taking you back through all of the religions of the world that I had to go through to get answers. And what I did was devised a series of 4 questions, basically just to compare religions. And remember, as a practical atheist, when I would go through each one of the world's religions, I was a clean slate at the time. And so we're going to do here what I did. I saved Christianity to the last. And you'll see why I chose to do that, mainly because of the confusion that was there. But today we're going to be looking at Zoroastrianism. And so I want to make this clear. I'm not comparing religions emotionally here. I'm just trying to test them rationally. And that's what I was doing at the time as well. So each episode is going to apply these same questions. And these questions are not going to change because the standard does not change. And so the religion is required to answer these questions and not the other way around. And the questions are really simple. Who is God? Who is man? What went wrong? And how's it fixed? Now, every worldview answers these questions whether it admits it or not. And if the answers collapse under scrutiny, then the system collapses with it. And so far, we've looked at Islam, Judaism, Taoism, Hinduism, Buddhism. And each one of these have claimed insight into reality, but each one of them has failed in a specific or an identifiable way. And so I'm going to take you further back into history now, because Zoroastrianism predates Christianity and Islam by centuries. And in many cases, it predates the moral language that people assume originated later. So the concepts of like good and evil and judgment and heaven and hell, angels, demons, even the end of time appear in Zoroastrianism. And that alone raised an important question, because if these ideas existed before Christianity, then either Christianity borrowed these ideas, is what I thought at the time, or Zoroastrianism identified real truths, but it failed to complete it. Now, this is not a hostile question. It's just a necessary question, because Zoroastrianism, it emerged in ancient Persia, and it shaped one of the most powerful empires in history. This was not a fringe belief system either. It governed the law, the culture, the moral expectation, and it means that its failures cannot be dismissed as ignorance or even isolation. Because if a religion with time and power and influence still cannot answer the fundamental questions coherently, then the problem is not historical limitation. The problem is internal. And so that matters today, because modern man still thinks the same way that Zoroastrianism did. And by that, most of us believe that good and evil are real. Most of us believe that moral choices matter. Most of us believe that history is moving somewhere. And history believes that human effort plays a decisive role in that. And so these assumptions, they don't come from nowhere. So when we test Zoroastrianism carefully, we're not mocking it, but we want to see whether these assumptions can actually bear the weight that we're going to place on them today. So we're going to apply these questions without any adjustment. So we will apply the questions the same as we have with the others. So who is God? Who is man? What went wrong? And how exactly is that fixed? And if the answer fails, then the system fails. And if the system fails, then much of what modern man assumes about morality and progress is going to fail with it. So before we can evaluate the answers, we have to be clear about what we're actually examining here. Zoroastrianism doesn't present itself as mythology at all. It presents itself as truth revealed to a specific man at a specific time, and then carried forward as a moral and a cosmic explanation of reality. And that man is Zoroaster, and he's also called Zarathustra. And here's the first problem, and it's not a little problem either. We don't know when Zoroaster lived. Now, some scholars place him anywhere between 1500 to 600 BC. That's not a small margin of time. That's nearly 1,000 years. And so that uncertainty affects everything that follows it because it does weaken the claim of any historical anchoring. Zoroastrianism also doesn't rest on any eyewitness testimony that was preserved in a fixed record either. It just rests on a tradition that developed over time. And then it got altered by political power, and then it got later reconstructed after a catastrophic loss. And the sacred writings of Zoroastrianism are collected in what's called the Avesta. And these texts were not preserved intact. A large portion of them were lost, especially during the conquests of Alexander the Great. But what does survive today exists because priests reconstructed prayers and the hymns and the teachings from memory, and some through oral transmission. And that matters not because ancient people were unintelligent, but because authority depends on preservation. If revelation is real, it doesn't have to be guessed at later, because if truth is given, it can be safeguarded. And when a system depends on reconstruction, interpretation will have to fill the gap. And that's where it introduces drift. So Zoroastrianism also developed in a close relationship with empire. It became the moral and religious framework of Persian rule. So law and governance and the religion blended it all together. And that gave it reach and stability, but it also tied the truth claims to political power. And that pattern should sound familiar to you. Because when belief systems gain institutional power, they tend to solidify morally while softening philosophically. And questions are settled by authority rather than coherence. So over time, internal contradictions, they're just tolerated rather than resolved. And Zoroastrianism is not unique in this. It's just an early example of it. So what we have to do at this point is that we have a religion that's claiming moral clarity, that shaped civilization, and that influenced later faiths. We also have a religion whose foundations are historically uncertain as well as textually reconstructed. And I'll have to admit now, that doesn't automatically make something false, but it does place limits on its authority. And that matters today because modern man lives downstream from these same assumptions. We trust systems that are built on revision. We trust truths that are maintained by consensus. We trust framework more than witnesses. And so Zoroastrianism shows us what happens when moral seriousness exists without a fixed revelation. It creates structure, it creates law, it creates responsibility, but it'll also leave unanswered questions that get embedded at the foundation. And these unanswered questions, they surface immediately when we turn to the first and most important question that I ask, which is, who is God? And at that question, Zoroastrianism will start to fracture. So once God is defined as limited, man necessarily has to take on a greater responsibility. Zoroastrianism presents a man as a moral agent that is positioned between two forces. Man is not fallen, he's not corrupted by nature. Man is capable of choosing rightly and then strengthening the truth through his actions. So the religion summarizes man's purpose with clarity. It's good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. And that is very practical because man's daily decisions directly affect the balance between truth and falsehood in the world. And so that view gives man dignity. It takes moral responsibility seriously. But it refuses to reduce evil to ignorance or social conditioning. And I say those are strengths, but it comes at a cost because Zoroastrianism assumes that man at his core is intact. Now, he may be tempted, he may be influenced, but he's not damaged. And that assumption dominates modern thinking today. Because modern psychology today often treats wrongdoing as though it's just some form of a maladaptive behavior. And modern politics, they treat injustice as just a structural problem or a systemic problem. That's why modern education treats moral failure as just a lack of awareness. That if you were just more socially aware, but if you look underneath, the belief is still the same. If you fix the environment, you inform the mind, the behavior will follow. Zoroastrianism held this belief long before the modern world adopted it. But history refuses to cooperate because the most educated societies still commit atrocities. The most refined moral codes still collapse under power. and the most enlightened revolutions still devour their own today. So if man were merely undecided, improvement would be steady. If man was fundamentally sound, progress would be cumulative, but it's not. Patterns repeat with unsettling consistency. Corruption doesn't even surprise us anymore. In fact, we expect it. From every single politician we see today, we expect corruption. And I don't care who it is, and I don't care which side of the aisle you look at. And Zoroastrianism gives man responsibility without realism, because what it does is it assigns him a role that he can't sustain. And when man fails, the system has no explanation beyond insufficient effort. What that does is create pressure that man must try harder, man must choose better, man must carry the weight of history. But that pressure doesn't produce virtue, it produces fatigue. Look at society today. And so this flaw becomes clear when we ask the next question. Because if it's true, if man is capable and responsible, then what exactly went wrong? Because something clearly did. And Zoroastrianism answers this question very carefully. Almost cautiously, it says, according to the system, nothing fundamentally broke in man. There was no collapse of human nature. There was no inherited disorder. There was no moment after which man became something other than what he was meant to be. Evil entered into the human condition through alignment. So man chose the lie. Man sided with disorder. Man empowered falsehood through action. The damage is real, but it's not structural. It's just the result of a repeated choice, not a corrupted nature. Now, that explanation will sound reasonable, and it even sounds familiar today, because many people today say the exact same thing. They say that violence comes from bad influences. It's the movie, it's the music, it's the games. They say that corruption comes from broken systems, systemic racism, systemic sexism. You fill in the blank for whatever corruption they see today, and it's because the system's broken. And they'll say that cruelty comes from trauma, or it comes from ignorance. Everyone's a victim. And so the assumption underneath all of it is identical, that man is basically sound and the problem lives outside of him. And Zoroastrianism was one of the first systems to formalize that belief. But again, this explanation will collapse under pressure. Because if evil is primarily external, then wouldn't education fix that? And if disorder is a matter of choice alone, then experience should correct it. And if man is intact and he's fully whole, then time should improve him. But history shows the opposite of that. Each generation repeats the same moral failures with different tools. It's the same sins, it's just technologically more advanced. And each system also produces the same abuses once power starts to concentrate. So each reform movement eventually becomes what it claimed to oppose. And that repetition is too consistent to dismiss it, because Zoroastrianism identifies the presence of evil, but it does not explain its persistence. It gives me a description of the battlefield, but not the wound. And that missing diagnosis matters, because if nothing truly went wrong in man, then no deep cure is necessary. And if no deep cure is necessary, then the solution will always be superficial. And that brings us directly to the final question. Because if the problem is choice rather than corruption, then how is it fixed? Zoroastrianism offers a solution that's consistent with its diagnosis. If man's not corrupted by nature, if evil enters primarily through choice, then the remedy must be sustained moral effort. That is exactly what Zoroastrianism teaches. That history is moving toward a final restoration. That truth will ultimately prevail. That evil will be exposed and defeated. That judgment will occur and creation will be renewed. But the path to that end matters, because that system depends on participation, and man must align himself with truth. Man must accumulate good thoughts. Man must accumulate good words and good deeds. Man has to actively strengthen order against disorder, because salvation is not received, it is achieved. Now that framework produces seriousness, because it demands discipline, it rejects moral laziness, and those are not small virtues. But it also produces something else, though. It produces uncertainty. no one knows when they've done enough. No one knows if the balance is going to hold. And no one knows whether future failures will outweigh past efforts. Judgment exists in that, but assurance does not. And that structure mirrors modern life today with accuracy. I see people work endlessly to justify themselves. They attempt to prove moral worth through productivity, through activism, through achievement, through protests, through alignment with approved causes, through banners, through shirts. You pick it. And what they fear is being on the wrong side of history, because history itself has become the judge. And the result of that is exhaustion. Zoroastrianism promises a future resolution, but it offers no present rest. Victory is always approaching. It's never secured. And any system that depends on human consistency will collapse under human inconsistency. Every person knows this about themselves, even if they refuse to say this out loud. And that's not a flaw at the edges of the system. It's just the inevitable outcome of its core assumption. If man carries the weight of their own salvation, then salvation is always going to feel fragile. And that brings everything together. Because once we line up the answers, the failure becomes visible. So line up the answers side by side, and then the problem's no longer subtle in this. Zoroastrianism doesn't fail because it ignores evil. It fails because it cannot resolve it. Look at the structure it creates. God is good, but not absolute. Man is responsible, but not wounded. Evil is real, but not rooted. And salvation is promised, but it's not secured. Each answer weakens the next. Because God is limited, then victory is delayed. And because man is assumed intact, failure is blamed on his effort. And because evil is externalized, corruption remains unexplained. Because salvation depends on accumulation, and assurance never arrives. That is not a minor theological issue. That is an internal contradiction. Because if God is not sovereign, then evil has standing. And if man is not broken, then history makes no sense. If the cure depends on man, then the cure is as unstable as the patient. Zoroastrianism wants moral seriousness without divine intervention. Does that sound familiar? It wants responsibility without rescue. It wants judgment without a redeemer. And that combination produces a tension without resolution. And that tension is not ancient. It's also modern, because you see it everywhere today. People feel morally accountable, but permanently anxious. They believe in justice, but they doubt forgiveness. They know right and wrong, but they cannot escape shame. And they are told to do better, to try harder, to align more perfectly. And when they fail, the system will offer no explanation beyond personal insufficiency. Zoroastrianism didn't invent this condition, but it does explain it. Because it shows what happens when man understands the problem intellectually, but is left alone to solve it. So the religion gets close enough to the truth to make the failure painful. It can see the battlefield. It can see the enemy. It predicts the end, but it never wins. And that is why it ultimately fails the questions. Because the true system doesn't merely describe reality, it resolves it. Which now brings us to the unavoidable conclusion. If Zoroastrianism can see this much and still fail, then the answer, if it exists at all, must come from somewhere else. Not from effort, not from balance, not from time, from intervention. Now, this is where Zoroastrianism almost convinced me it was right. And not because it pointed to God, but because it did not require God to act. As an atheist, Zoroastrianism felt honest. It confirmed something that I already believed about religion itself, that people create systems where they can save themselves. Zoroastrianism doesn't deny evil, and that mattered to me because many of the modern ideologies today pretend that evil is just a misunderstanding or a social failure or a systemic problem. Zoroastrianism rejected that. It says that evil is real, it's destructive, and it's opposed to truth. But it also did something else. It made salvation achievable without surrender. You don't need grace. You don't need rescue. You don't need a decisive act of God. You need discipline. You need effort. You need alignment. And that confirmed my suspicions at the time. Because religion, as I thought about it, it's not about God intervening in anything. It's about humans coping with reality, creating moral frameworks and motivating behavior. And Zoroastrianism seemed to me to look like proof. Because here was an ancient system that took evil seriously, it took responsibility seriously, it took judgment seriously, and it still left the burden squarely on man. Now that makes sense to an atheist, because what it does is it preserves human autonomy, it preserves human dignity, it preserves the illusion of control. Most importantly, it avoids the most offensive idea of all, that man cannot fix himself. Zoroastrianism allowed me to believe that the problem was hard, but it was manageable. That the universe was moral, but it's impersonal. Now, that effort mattered more than dependence, because it doesn't ask me to kneel, it doesn't ask me to perform. And that's why modern people like it, even if they've never even heard the name of Zoroastrianism. You still see it everywhere. People believe that they can outwork guilt, that they can outperform shame, that they can out-align their past, that they can outpace judgment. They believe history bends towards justice because enough people will choose correctly. That belief did not come from science. It came from ancient moral systems just like this one. Zoroastrianism is proof that man has always wanted responsibility without helplessness, judgment without mercy, salvation without surrender. But here's the problem, and I couldn't ignore this forever. If man could save himself, history would look different. If moral effort worked, civilizations would stabilize instead of decaying. And if discipline were enough, power would not corrupt so predictably. If balance were possible, evil would diminish. Instead, it just changes names. Zoroastrianism confirmed my atheism at first because it showed how sophisticated self-salvation could be. But over time, it began to undermine it, because the system didn't merely fail to save man, it quietly admitted that he needed saving. It just refused to say from what. Zoroastrianism sees the war. It sees the cost. It sees the end. But what it never explains is, why does man keep losing ground even when he knows the rules? And that question eventually broke my atheism. Because if every system that relies on human effort collapses, then the problem's not ignorance, it's not environment, it's not even motivation. The problem is man himself. Zoroastrianism stops just short of that admission. It represents something important in the history of human thought. It's one of the last serious attempts to answer the biggest question without abandoning them. It asks about God, it asks about evil, it even asks about judgment and the end of history. And it almost gets you there. But when Zoroastrianism fails, something decisive happens. Man does not immediately turn to revelation. He doesn't immediately abandon religion either. He retreats. Instead of asking bigger questions, he asks smaller ones. Instead of asking, who is God? He asks, how do we keep order? Instead of asking what went wrong with man, he asks, how do we prevent disruption? Instead of asking, how is this fixed? Man asks, how do we manage life as it is? That is not progress. That is contraction. Zoroastrianism leaves man with a choice that he doesn't want to face. Either man cannot save himself, or no one is coming. And rather than confront that dilemma, entire civilizations will choose a third option. They stop asking. And that is the concern for the modern age today. Because no one asks, who is God? Who is man? What went wrong and how's it fixed? We see that in every bit of our society today. So, Zoroastrianism may have lost its temples, its empires, its cultural dominance, but its answers to these questions have survived. Modern society answers the four questions almost exactly the same. God is acknowledged, if at all, as distant or limited, that he may exist, but he does not act, he doesn't intervene, and he doesn't judge decisively. Man is assumed to be fundamentally capable, flawed, yes, but improvable. He's educable, he's correctable. And what went wrong is explained as just misalignment, just bad ideas, bad systems, bad incentives. Evil is external, not rooted. And how's it fixed? Well, through effort, through better choices, through progressive ideas over time. So that is Zoroastrianism without the fire in the temples. Modern language has just replaced ancient terms, but the structure is identical. Good versus evil becomes right side of history versus wrong side. Judgment becomes social approval or cancellation. Salvation becomes moral performance, and hope becomes eventual progress. And just like Zoroastrianism, modern society is serious. It still believes that moral failure matters, believes consequences exist, and it believes the future depends on human action. But it carries the same fatal flaw. It puts the burden of salvation on man. And history has already told us how this ends. When a man is asked to save himself, he becomes anxious. When judgment exists without mercy, he becomes defensive. When effort replaces grace, he becomes exhausted. And when victory is delayed, he becomes bitter. Zoroastrianism predicted an eventual triumph of good, but it never delivered one in history. Empires rose under it and fell under it. Moral clarity did not prevent corruption, and responsibility did not stop the decay. Modern society seems to follow that same path. They demand virtue but offer no forgiveness, demand alignment but no repentance, and demand progress but deny rest. And so the result is exactly what you would expect. A culture that is obsessed with morality and starved of peace. A people that is burdened with guilt and offered no release, in a society that knows judgment is real, but it cannot escape it. So Zoroastrianism shows us that knowing the problem is not the same as solving it. It shows a moral seriousness without divine action leads to collapse. It shows us that responsibility without redemption produces despair. And it shows us that effort without rescue always ends the same way. That is not ancient history. That is the world we live in now. And if the answers don't change, the ending doesn't change either. Next week, we're going to turn to systems that respond to that failure, not by solving it, but by shrinking the question. Next week, we'll look at Confucianism and Shinto. They did not try to redeem man. They tried to preserve order. And that move tells us something unsettling. That when salvation feels like it's impossible, man will settle for stability. And that's where we will go next week on Veritate. In nomine Patri, Filii, Spiritui Sancti. Amen.
Thank you for listening to Veritate. If you would like to contact the show, please email us at veritate@yahoo.com. That's veritate@yahoo.com. Thanks again, and we look forward to hearing from you. May God bless you all.